The wind howled through the red desert canyons like a wounded animal, carrying with it the sting of early winter and the promise of harder days ahead. Clara Whitmore pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down the main street of Silver Creek, her 5-year-old son Micah clutching her hand with fingers that had gone numb from the cold. Behind them, the ramshackle boarding house where they'd lived for the past 2 years stood dark against the gray morning sky. Mrs. Henley, the proprietress, had made it clear the night before. They had until sunrise to gather their belongings and leave. The death of Clara's husband Samuel 3 weeks prior had sealed their fate. A gambler's widow with a child and no means of support was bad for business, she'd said, her pinched face showing no trace of the sympathy she'd once feigned when Samuel's pockets had been full of silver. "Mama, where are we going?" Micah's voice was small, nearly lost in the wind. His pale blue eyes, so like his father's, though Clara prayed he'd inherited nothing else from that man, looked up at her with trust she knew she didn't deserve. "Somewhere safe, my love." Clara lied, forcing a smile that felt like breaking glass. The truth was, she had no idea where they would go. The $20 hidden in her boot money she'd managed to secret away from Samuel's gambling would perhaps buy them passage on a stagecoach. But to where? And what then? The town was already stirring to life. Shopkeepers swept their stoops, and the smell of baking bread from the bakery made Micah's stomach growl audibly. Clara's heart clenched. The boy had eaten nothing but thin porridge for days. She steered them away from Main Street, taking the back alleys where they were less likely to encounter the good citizens of Silver Creek. She'd learned in the past weeks that grief was only acceptable when it came with money. A poor widow was not a figure of sympathy but of suspicion. "That's her," she heard someone whisper as they passed the general store. The gambler's woman. Heard tell she knew about his debts all along. Probably encouraged him in his ways. Clara kept her head high, though each word struck like a physical blow. They knew nothing of the truth, how Samuel had changed after they'd married, how his promises of fortune in the silver mines had dissolved into nights spent at the card tables, how she'd begged him to stop even as his temper grew shorter and his fists grew quicker. The morning Samuel died, he'd come home stinking of whiskey and defeat, raving about a debt he couldn't pay, about men who were coming for him. Clara had been mending Micah's only winter shirt when they heard the shots. 3 of them, sharp and final in the pre-dawn darkness. By the time she'd reached the street, Samuel lay still in the dust, and the men who'd killed him were already riding away. No one had seen anything. No one wanted to be involved with a gambler's affairs. They reached the edge of town where Clara had hidden their few possessions behind the old stable. 2 carpetbags held everything they owned in the world. Some clothes, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents, and a few toys Micah couldn't bear to leave behind. As she loaded them onto a borrowed handcart, her fingers found the folded newspaper she'd been carrying for a week. The advertisement was simple. "Respectable rancher seeks capable woman for marriage. Must be skilled in household management. Widows acceptable. Write to J. Hartwell, Elk Mountain Ranch, Colorado Territory." Clara had written the letter in desperation 5 days ago, claiming only that she was a widow who could cook, clean, and keep house. She'd said nothing of Micah. How could she? What man would take on another man's child, especially the child of a known gambler? But perhaps, if she could just get there, if she could prove herself useful first. "Mama, I'm cold," Micah said, and Clara realized they'd been standing still too long. The sun was fully up now, and she could see curtains twitching in windows. Soon, someone would wonder why the gambler's widow was loitering by the stable with packed bags. "Come here, sweet boy," she said, lifting him onto the handcart atop their bags. She took off her own thin coat and wrapped it around him, ignoring the bite of the wind through her dress. "We're going on an adventure." The stage depot was a mile outside town, and Clara pushed the handcart through the rutted roads, her boots slipping on frost-slick stones. By the time they arrived, her hands were raw and bleeding. But the morning stage to Denver was preparing to leave. From there, She could catch another to the mountain towns near the Colorado-New Mexico border. The ticket agent, a grizzled man with kind eyes, looked at her with concern. "That's rough country you're heading to, ma'am." "You got people waiting for you?" Clara thought of the letter she'd sent to the mysterious J. Hartwell, of the answer that might or might not be waiting. "Yes," she said firmly. "Family." The journey was a blur of discomfort and exhaustion. The stagecoach lurched and swayed over rough roads, and Micah grew sick from the motion. Clara held him as he fevered, cooling his forehead with her handkerchief dipped in water from her canteen. Other passengers moved away from them, muttering about contagion, leaving mother and child isolated in their corner of the coach. They spent nights in way stations that were little more than lean-tos with dirt floors. Clara used precious coins to buy thin soup and hard bread, making sure Micah ate even when her own stomach cramped with hunger. The boy grew thinner and quieter with each passing day, and Clara began to fear she'd made a terrible mistake. What if this rancher had already found a wife? What if her letter had never arrived? What if they were traveling toward nothing but more rejection and starvation? On the 5th day, they reached Willow Springs, the closest town to Elk Mountain Ranch according to her worn map. It was barely more than a cluster of buildings huddled against the mountain's base, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel that had seen better days. Snow was falling steadily now, and Micah shivered uncontrollably despite being wrapped in everything warm they owned. Clara used some of her last coins to rent a room at the hotel. The proprietress, a stern woman named Mrs. Crawford, looked at them with barely concealed disapproval. "You meeting someone here?" she asked pointedly. "Perhaps," Clara said, too tired to elaborate. She needed to think, to plan. She couldn't simply arrive at this ranch with Micah in tow, but she couldn't leave him here alone either. That night, as Micah slept fitfully in the narrow bed, Clara sat by the window watching the snow fall. Elk Mountain loomed in the distance, its peaks lost in clouds. Somewhere up there was a ranch, and a man who might be her salvation or her final disappointment. She thought of the advertisement again. Respectable rancher. What kind of man advertised for a wife in the newspaper? Likely someone as desperate as she was, someone the local women had rejected for good reason. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold. Clara left Micah sleeping and went to the general store to inquire about the ranch. The shopkeeper, Mr. Donnelly, scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. "Jed Hartwell? Aye, I know him. Comes down every few weeks for supplies. Big fella, keeps to himself mostly. Lost his mother last spring, probably why he's looking for a wife. The ranch is a day's ride up the mountain road, if the snow ain't too deep." He paused, studying Clara with sharp eyes. "You the woman he sent for?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. So the rancher was real, and apparently expecting her. But what would happen when he discovered she deceived him? She was still wrestling with her decision when the shop door opened, bringing a gust of icy wind and the largest man Clara had ever seen. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe, and his broad shoulders seemed to fill the entire entrance. His face was weathered and tanned despite the winter, with deep lines around gray eyes that spoke of years squinting into sun and snow. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, and a scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. "Jed, mister," Donnelly called out cheerfully. "Wasn't expecting you for another week." The giant nodded silently, his eyes scanning the shop and landing on Clara. She felt exposed under that steady gaze, as if he could see through to every secret she carried. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her mended dress, her chapped hands, the weariness she knew must show in her face. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice deep and rough as gravel. He touched the brim of his hat politely, then turned to the shopkeeper. "Need supplies. List is same as usual." Clara found herself rooted to the spot. This was him, J. Hartwell, the man she'd intended to marry under false pretenses. He was nothing like she'd imagined. She'd pictured someone older, perhaps infirm, someone who needed a wife for practical reasons and wouldn't look too closely at what she brought with her. This man looked like he could wrestle a bear and win. What would such a man do when he discovered her deception? She slipped out of the store while the men conducted their business, her mind racing. She had to leave, had to take Micah and find somewhere else, anywhere else. But even as she thought it, she knew it was impossible. Her money was nearly gone. Micah was sick. Winter was closing in. They would die in these mountains if she tried to run now. Back at the hotel, she found Micah awake and crying. His fever returned. Mrs. Crawford stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "That boy needs a doctor," she said flatly. "And you need to pay for another night if you're staying." Clara counted her remaining coins, not enough for both doctor and room. "Please," she began. But Mrs. Crawford was already shaking her head. "I run a business, not a charity. You'll need to be out by noon." Clara was still holding Micah, trying to cool his fever with a damp cloth, when heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway. Jed Hartwell appeared in the doorway, having to bend nearly double to fit. His gray eyes took in the scene, the sick child, Clara's desperate face, their packed bags. "You're the woman who answered my advertisement," he said. It wasn't a question. Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. This was it. He would see Micah, understand her deception, and send them both away. She held her son tighter, as if she could shield him from the rejection to come. But Jed Hartwell just stood there, looking at them with those unreadable gray eyes. Then, finally, he spoke. "Boy got a name?" Clara's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. She had rehearsed a dozen explanations, 100 apologies, but faced with Jed Hartwell's unexpected question, every word fled her mind. Micah stirred in her arms, whimpering softly, his small body burning with fever. "His name is Micah," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my son." Jed nodded slowly, his expression unchanged. "Boy looks poorly. I know I should have told you." Clara began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In my letter, I should have said I had a child, but I was desperate. And I thought if you knew me first, if I could prove I could keep house and work hard, then maybe." She trailed off, seeing the futility of it all. "I'm sorry, we'll go. I just need to find somewhere for tonight, until he's well enough to travel." "Where are you planning to go?" Jed asked, still standing in the doorway, his bulk blocking most of the light from the hallway. Clara looked down at Micah's flushed face. Where indeed? She had no answer, no plan beyond this moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "Mrs." Crawford pushed past Jed, her face stern. "Well, you can't stay here without payment. I've got a business to run." "Boy needs tending," Jed said quietly, but there was something in his tone that made Mrs. Crawford step back. He looked at Clara again. "You got any doctoring knowledge?" "Some. My mother taught me about herbs and fever remedies. But he needs warmth and rest more than anything." Jed was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could feel her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. Then he turned to Mrs. Crawford. "Put their charges on my account. They'll be leaving with me." "But," Clara started. "Ranch has plenty of room," he said simply. "Boy can rest there. We can sort out the rest later." Clara stared at him, unable to process what was happening. You're not angry? About my deception? Seems to me a mother does what she needs to for her young one." Jed said, "Can't fault that. Question is, can you still cook and keep house?" "Yes," Clara said quickly. "Yes, I can do all that. I'm a hard worker. Mr. Hartwell, you won't regret—" "We'll see," he interrupted, but not unkindly. "For now, let's get the boy somewhere warm. Got the wagon outside. I'll load your things." Everything happened quickly after that. Jed carried their bags as if they weighed nothing, while Clara wrapped Micah in every blanket Mrs. Crawford grudgingly provided. The wagon was sturdy and filled with supplies from the general store. Jed had laid out buffalo robes in the back, creating a warm nest. "Best if you ride back here with the boy," he said, helping Clara climb up. His hands were gentle despite their size, and Clara noticed they were scarred from years of hard work. The journey up the mountain was like traveling into another world. The road, such as it was, wound between towering pines laden with snow. Cliffs rose on one side while precipitous drops yawned on the other. Clara held Micah close, trying to cushion him from the wagon's jolts, while marveling at how expertly Jed handled the team of horses. He didn't speak much, only occasionally pointing out landmarks. "That's Eagle Rock," or "Stream's good for fishing come spring." Clara found his silence oddly comforting after years of Samuel's empty chatter and broken promises. As the day wore on and they climbed higher, Micah's fever seemed to ease slightly. He opened his eyes once, looking around with wonder. "Mama, are we in the clouds?" "Nearly, sweet boy," Clara said, smoothing his hair. "Is that giant taking us to his castle in the sky?" Clara glanced at Jed's broad back, wondering if he'd heard. If he had, he gave no sign. "Something like that." She told Micah. The sun was setting when they finally rounded a bend, and Clara got her first glimpse of Elk Mountain Ranch. It wasn't what she'd expected. Instead of a rough cabin, a substantial log house sat in a clearing, smoke rising from a stone chimney. A large barn and several outbuildings suggested prosperity, or at least stability. Mountains rose on three sides, creating a natural shelter, while the fourth side opened onto a vista that took Clara's breath away. Rolling meadows that must be beautiful in summer, now blanketed in pristine white. "It's beautiful," she said without thinking. Jed glanced back at her, and she thought she saw surprise in his eyes. "It's home," he said simply. He pulled the wagon up to the front door and came around to help them down. "I'll get the boy," he said, and before Clara could protest, he had lifted Micah into his arms as easily as if the child weighed nothing. The inside of the house was warm and clean. Though clearly lacking a woman's touch, everything was functional. Sturdy furniture, warm rugs, a massive stone fireplace, but there were no curtains at the windows, no flowers or decorative touches. It was a house waiting for someone to make it a home. Jed carried Micah straight to a small room off the kitchen. "Was my mother's sewing room," he said. "Figure it'll do for the boy. Warmest room in the house, being next to the kitchen." He set Micah gently on the narrow bed, and Clara was struck by how careful he was. This giant of a man handling her sick child like fragile glass. She bustled about, removing Micah's damp clothes and tucking him under thick quilts that smelled of lavender and cedar. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Jed. "I know this isn't what you expected. If you want us to leave once he's well." "You always plan for the worst?" Jed asked, and she thought she detected the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. "Experience has taught me to," Clara said quietly. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Kitchen's through there. You'll find what you need to make some broth for the boy. I'll bring in your things and see to the horses." Left alone, Clara explored the kitchen. It was well stocked and organized, with a modern cook stove and a large pantry. She found ingredients for a simple chicken broth and set it to simmer, then made a pot of coffee. Through the window, she could see Jed in the barn, his movements efficient as he tended to the animals. When he came back in, bringing cold air and the smell of snow with him, she had coffee waiting and a simple meal of beans and cornbread warming on the stove. "Didn't expect you to start working right away," he said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "I needed to do something," Clara admitted. "And Micah needs to eat when he wakes." They sat at the large kitchen table, an awkward silence falling between them. Clara noticed Jed ate neatly despite his size, his manners better than many of the so-called gentlemen she'd known in town. "I should explain," she began. "Only if you want to." Jed said, "Your business is your own." This unexpected courtesy nearly undid her. After weeks of judgment and whispers, his simple acceptance was overwhelming. "His father was a gambler," she said quietly. "He died 3 weeks ago, shot over a debt. The town, they made it clear we weren't welcome anymore." Jed nodded, his face expressionless. Hard life for a woman alone. "I didn't start alone," Clara said, surprising herself with the bitterness in her voice. "I was a school teacher when I met Samuel. He promised me the world, said he'd strike it rich in the silver mines." She laughed humorlessly. "Instead, he struck out at the card tables. And sometimes at us." She hadn't meant to say that last part. It hung in the air between them like smoke. Jed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He gone now," Jed said finally. "That's what matters." From the other room, they heard Micah calling weakly for his mother. Clara jumped up, grateful for the interruption. She found her son awake and coherent, his fever finally breaking. "Mama, where are we?" "Somewhere safe, my love. Are you hungry?" Micah nodded. Then his eyes went wide as Jed appeared in the doorway. "The giant!" "Micah," Clara admonished, mortified, but Jed's weathered face creased in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Suppose I am at that. You feeling better, boy?" Micah nodded shyly. Shrinking back against Clara, she couldn't blame him. After Samuel's unpredictable temper, the child was wary of men. "I'll bring the broth," Jed said, disappearing back to the kitchen. As Clara fed Micah small spoonfuls of the warm liquid, she was aware of Jed moving about in the other room. The domestic sounds, dishes being washed, the stove being banked for the night, were strangely comforting. When Micah finished eating and dozed off again, Clara found Jed sitting by the fire in the main room, a book in his hands. He looked up as she entered. "Boy settling?" "Yes, the fever's broken. He should be much better by morning." "Good." He marked his place in the book and set it aside. "We should talk about arrangements." Clara's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. The conditions, the rejection disguised as reason. "You answered my advertisement for a wife," Jed said bluntly. "I'm guessing that's still what you're looking for. A home, security for you and the boy." Yes," Clara admitted. "But I understand if I'm not a man for fancy words or courting." Jed continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I need someone to help run this place. Cook, keep house, tend the garden come spring. In return, you'd have a home, protection, and everything you and the boy need." Clara stared at him. "You're still offering marriage, even with Micah?" "Boy needs a home too." Jed said simply, "I'm not his father, won't pretend to be, but I can offer him a safe place to grow up." "Why?" Clara had to ask. "Why would you take us on? We're nothing but trouble. The whole town was glad to see us go." Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Lost my brother when he was about the boy's age," he said finally. "Fever took him one winter. My mother never got over it. Spent her last years wondering if she could have done more, if she'd had the right medicines or a warmer house." He looked at Clara directly. "I've got medicines, and I've got a warm house. Seems foolish to turn away folks who need them." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This gruff, silent man was offering more kindness than she'd known in years. "I don't know what to say." "Don't have to say anything tonight. You're tired. Boy's sick. Get some rest. We can work out the details when you're both stronger." He stood, and Clara was again struck by his sheer size. "Your room's at the end of the hall. Was my mother's. You'll find what you need. Mr. Hartwell. Jed," he corrected. "If we're going to do this, might as well start with names." "Jed," Clara repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "Thank you for everything." He nodded awkwardly and headed for the stairs. At the bottom, he paused. "One more thing. I'm not a drinking man, and I don't hold with gambling. You'll have no worry on those counts." The relief that flooded through Clara was so intense she had to grip the back of a chair. "Good," she managed. "That's good." After he'd gone upstairs, Clara checked on Micah once more, then made her way to the room Jed had indicated. It was larger than any bedroom she'd had since childhood, with a big bed covered in a beautiful quilt, a wardrobe, and a small writing desk by the window. Her bags were already there, placed carefully by the door. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe that still held the faint scent of lavender. On the bedside table was a photograph of a woman who must have been Jed's mother. A small, delicate woman with kind eyes and a determined chin. I'll try to do right by your son," Clara whispered to the photograph, "if he'll let me." As she prepared for bed, she could hear Jed moving about upstairs, the old house creaking under his weight. It was strange, being in a house with a man again, but different from before. Samuel had filled every space with his presence, his moods, his demands. Jed seemed to move carefully, as if trying not to disturb. Clara lay in the soft bed, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the main room. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something like safety. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She would have to prove herself useful, would have to navigate whatever arrangement they came to. She would have to help Micah adjust to this new life, this new man who might become… what? Not a father, Jed had said, but perhaps something else, something steady and safe. As sleep finally claimed her, Clara's last thought was of Jed's scarred hands, so gentle with her sick child. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had found their way home. The first week at Elk Mountain Ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and routine. Clara threw herself into the work with desperate energy, rising before dawn to start the fires and prepare breakfast, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending clothes that barely needed mending. She was determined to prove her worth, to show Jed he hadn't made a mistake. Micah recovered quickly, as children do, and within days was exploring the house with wide-eyed curiosity. He remained wary of Jed, ducking behind Clara's skirts whenever the big man entered a room. But Clara noticed he watched their host with fascination when he thought no one was looking. Jed, for his part, seemed to barely notice them. He left early each morning to tend to the cattle and horses, returning only for meals which he ate in near silence. He was unfailingly polite, always thanking Clara for the food, always asking after Micah's health. But there was a distance there, as if invisible walls surrounded him. It was on the 8th day that things began to shift. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread for the evening meal, when she heard Micah's voice from outside, high and excited. Through the window, she saw him standing at the barn door, peering inside. "Mr. Giant, sir, what are you doing?" Clara's heart jumped. She quickly wiped her floury hands and hurried outside, ready to apologize and pull Micah away. But she stopped short at the sight before her. Jed was in the barn, brushing down a small pinto pony. He glanced at Micah, then continued his work. "Getting Sally here ready for winter. Her coat needs thickening up." "Sally's a funny name for a horse," Micah said, inching closer. "My mother named her. Said she looked like a Sally she knew back east." Micah took another step. Can I touch her?" Clara held her breath. Jed straightened up, and for a moment she thought he would refuse. Then he set down the brush. "You ever been around horses, boy?" Micah shook his head. "First rule, move slow. Horses spook easy. Second rule, let them smell you first. Here." Jed took Micah's small hand in his large one, extending it slowly toward Sally's nose. The pony sniffed delicately, then pushed her nose into Micah's palm, looking for treats. Micah giggled, a sound Clara hadn't heard in weeks. "She's soft and greedy," Jed said, and Clara could swear she heard amusement in his voice. "You want to help brush her?" For the next hour, Clara watched from the kitchen window as Jed patiently showed Micah how to care for the pony. He lifted the boy onto a stool so he could reach Sally's back, guiding his hands with the brush, explaining about checking for burrs and why horses needed regular grooming. When they finally came in for lunch, Micah was chattering excitedly. "Mama, did you know horses have different kinds of hair? And Sally likes apples, but only if they're cut up small. And Jed says maybe I can learn to ride her when the weather's better." "Mr. Hartwell," Clara corrected gently. "It's all right," Jed said, washing his hands at the pump. "Jed's fine." That afternoon, instead of disappearing back to work immediately after lunch, Jed lingered. "Boy did good today. Natural touch with animals." "He's always been gentle," Clara said, watching Micah play with some wooden blocks she'd found in a cupboard. Even in difficult times. Jed nodded, understanding passing between them. Thought I might teach him riding, if you're agreeable. Sally's gentle. Good for beginners. Yes, of course. Thank you. It became a pattern. Each afternoon, after the heavy work was done, Jed would take Micah to the barn. First just to visit Sally and help with her care, then leading her around the corral, and finally, on a clear day when the snow had stopped falling, lifting Micah onto her back. Clara watched from the porch, her mending forgotten in her lap, as Jed led the pony in slow circles, one hand on the lead rope, the other steadying Micah. The boy's face glowed with joy, and when he called out, "Look, Mama, I'm riding," her eyes filled with tears. That evening, as she tucked Micah into bed, he said sleepily, "I like it here, Mama, Mr. Jed, he's not scary like I thought. He's just real big." "Yes, he is," Clara agreed, smoothing his hair. "Do you think he likes us being here?" Clara thought of the patience Jed had shown, the quiet kindness. "I think he does." "Good." Micah yawned. "I like Sally, and the mountains, and having our own rooms. We're staying forever, right? We'll see. Sweet boy. We'll see." But even as she said it, Clara felt the weight of uncertainty. They'd been here over a week, and still no discussion of the arrangement Jed had mentioned. Was she a housekeeper? A future wife? Something in between? She found Jed in the main room, as had become their evening custom. He sat by the fire with his book. She'd learned he was slowly working his way through his mother's collection of novels, though his reading was labored. "Micah's asleep," she said, taking the chair across from him. "Good. Boy had a full day." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Clara gathered her courage. "Jed, we should talk about what happens now." He marked his place carefully and set the book aside. "Been thinking on that myself. I need to know where I stand, what you expect. I can't live in uncertainty." Jed nodded slowly. "Fair enough." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Truth is, I'm not sure myself. Thought I knew what I wanted when I placed that advertisement. A wife, someone to help with the ranch. Maybe give me sons to pass it on to someday." Clara's heart sank. Of course, he would want his own children, not another man's son. "But now," Jed continued, "seems like what I've got is different than what I planned. Not bad different, just different. If you want us to leave..." "Did I say that?" His voice was sharp, and Clara flinched. Jed sighed, rubbing his face. "Sorry, I'm no good with words. What I mean is, maybe we take it slow. You're here, you're working, the boy's settling in. Come spring, if we're all still getting along, we can talk about making it official. A trial period," Clara said, "if you want to call it that. Give us all time to be sure." It was sensible, Clara told herself. Practical. So why did she feel disappointed? "And if come spring you decide we don't suit, then I'll make sure you get somewhere safe, with enough money to start fresh." Jed looked at her directly. "I'm not the kind of man to put a woman and child out with nothing. Whatever happens, you'll be taken care of." The kindness of it, the simple decency, made Clara's throat tight. "Thank you." "One more thing," Jed said. "The boy, Micah, he's a good kid. Reminds me of..." He paused, swallowing hard. "You don't have to worry about me treating him poorly, or you. I know some men, when they drink or get angry. I'm not like that." "I know," Clara said softly. And she did. In all the time they'd been here, she'd never seen Jed raise his voice or his hand. Never seen him take a drink of anything stronger than coffee. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. The days fell into a rhythm. Morning chores, afternoon lessons with Micah. Clara had found some old primers and was teaching him his letters. And evening gathered around the fire. Sometimes Jed would tell stories of the ranch, of his parents who'd carved this place out of wilderness, of cattle drives and mountain lions and the time a blizzard trapped them for 2 weeks. Micah began calling him Uncle Jed. which seemed to startle the big man the first time he heard it. But he didn't correct the boy, and Clara saw something soften in his eyes when Micah would run to greet him after a day's work. One evening, a fierce storm blew in, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling against the glass. The temperature dropped so suddenly that ice formed inside the window panes. Clara built up the fire in Micah's room, but still the boy shivered. "It's too cold in there," she told Jed, finding him adding wood to the main fireplace. "The walls are thinner than the rest of the house." Without a word, Jed went to Micah's room. Clara followed, watching as he felt the walls, checking for drafts. "You're right. Won't do for tonight. Boy can sleep out here by the fire." They made a bed of blankets and pillows on the floor near the hearth. Micah thought it was a grand adventure, snuggling down in his makeshift bed with obvious delight. But as the night wore on and the storm worsened, Clara found herself checking on him repeatedly, worried about the cold. "You'll wear a hole in the floor," Jed said mildly from his chair. "I can't help it. What if the fire dies? What if—" "Then we'll build it back up." He stood. "Get some blankets. We'll all sleep out here tonight. Easier to keep watch." And so they did, making beds on the floor like children camping. Clara lay on one side of Micah, Jed on the other, the firelight dancing over their faces. The storm howled outside, but inside was warm and safe. Sometime in the night, Clara woke to find Micah had rolled over, curling against Jed's broad back. She held her breath, waiting for the man to shift away. Instead, Jed carefully adjusted the blanket over the boy, his movements gentle in the dim light. In that moment, watching this giant of a man take care not to wake a sleeping child, Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. A seed planted in frozen ground, waiting for spring. The storm passed, leaving the world crystalline and new. Jed and Micah ventured out to check on the animals, the boy riding on Jed's shoulders, his delighted laughter echoing off the mountain peaks. Clara watched from the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and thought that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. That night, after Micah was asleep in his own room, Jed had spent the day insulating the walls. Clara found herself reluctant to go to bed. The evening by the fire had become her favorite time. These quiet hours when the day's work was done and conversation came easier in the firelight. "Read to me?" Jed asked suddenly, holding out his book. "My eyes are tired." Clara took the book. Jane Eyre. She saw with surprise, "Your mother had good taste. She loved books, always said I should read more, but—" He shrugged, embarrassed. "Never had much schooling. The words come slow. Would you like me to help? Not just reading aloud, but teaching?" Jed looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression. "You do that?" "Of course. We're already teaching Micah. No reason you can't join us." And so another piece fell into place. Each afternoon became lesson time for both her boys, as Clara had begun to think of them. Micah practiced his letters while Jed worked through primers, his big fingers careful with the pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're a natural teacher," Jed told her one day after successfully reading a full page without help. "I was a teacher before." Clara reminded him, "It's nice to use those skills again. Must have been hard to give that up." Clara thought of the schoolhouse she'd loved, the children she'd taught, the life she'd built before Samuel had swept in with his promises. It was, but we can't always choose our paths. "No," Jed agreed quietly, "but sometimes the path we're forced onto leads somewhere better than we planned." Their eyes met across the table, and Clara felt that seed of possibility push a little deeper into the soil of her heart. Spring was still months away, but already she could feel the thaw beginning. The first hints of spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow began to retreat from the lower meadows, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. Ice melted from the eaves in steady drips during the day, only to refreeze into glittering icicles at night. The air still held winter's bite, but there was a softness to it now, a promise of warmer days ahead. It was on such a morning, with pale sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, that Jed announced he needed to ride to the far pastures to check on the cattle. Haven't been able to get through for weeks with the snow, he explained over breakfast. Need to make sure they're all accounted for. Check for new calves. How long will you be gone? Clara asked, trying to keep the concern from her voice. In the months since their arrival, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the solid reliability of knowing he was nearby. Most of the day, maybe overnight if I find any trouble. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. You'll be all right here? Of course, Clara said quickly. We managed on our own before. That's not what Jed stopped, shaking his head. Just be careful. Lock the doors at night. The rifle's over the mantel if you need it. After he left, the house felt strangely empty. Micah helped Clara with the morning chores, chattering about Sally and asking when he could ride her again. But even he seemed to feel Jed's absence, glancing toward the door frequently as if expecting the big man to appear. By afternoon, Clara had run out of tasks to occupy herself. The house was spotless. Bread was rising for dinner, and Micah was napping after his lessons. She found herself at the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of Jed returning. This is foolish, she muttered to herself. He'd been gone one day, and she was acting like a worried wife. The thought stopped her cold, somewhere over the winter months, without her noticing. She'd begun thinking of this place as home, of Jed as what? Not her husband. Certainly, they'd maintained careful boundaries, separate rooms, separate lives that only intersected in the common areas of the house. But there was something there, some connection that had grown as steady and quiet as Jed himself. That evening, as she tucked Micah into bed, he asked, "When's Uncle Jed coming home?" "Tomorrow, most likely." "I don't like when he's gone," Micah said solemnly. "It's too quiet." Clara smiled, smoothing his hair. "I know what you mean." She was banking the fires for the night when she heard hoofbeats. Her heart leaped, but caution made her peer through the curtains first. In the moonlight, she could see Jed's familiar form dismounting from his horse. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by embarrassment at the strength of her reaction. She opened the door as he approached, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. "You're back early. Found them all in the near valley." "Didn't need to go as far as I thought." He paused on the threshold, looking down at her. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, fine. Come in. You must be freezing. I'll heat up some stew." As Jed ate, he told her about finding the cattle, about the 3 new calves that had been born despite the harsh winter. His face, usually so guarded, was animated as he described the stubborn cow who'd hidden her calf in a cave. "Took me an hour to convince her I wasn't trying to steal it," he said, and Clara was delighted to hear him actually chuckle. "I'm glad they're all safe," she said, pouring him more coffee. "Yeah." He wrapped his large hands around the mug, steam rising between them. "Clara, I've been thinking." Her stomach tightened. Here it was. Spring was approaching. And with it, the decision they'd postponed. "The winter's near done," he continued. "You've been here 4 months now." "Yes. I told you we'd decide come spring about arrangements." Clara set down the coffee pot carefully, proud that her hands didn't shake. "You did." Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. Then he looked up at her, and the uncertainty in his eyes matched her own. "Would you ride with me tomorrow? There's something I want to show you. Might help us figure things out." "Of course. But what about Micah?" "Bring him. He's old enough for a longer ride, and Sally needs the exercise." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with that particular quality of light that comes to the mountains in early spring. Clara dressed carefully in a riding skirt, a luxury she'd made from fabric found in Mrs. Hartwell's sewing room. Micah was beside himself with excitement at the prospect of a real ride, not just circles in the corral. Jed had 3 horses saddled and waiting, Sally for Micah, a gentle mare named Bess for Clara, and his own large gelding. Duke. He lifted Micah onto Sally's back as if the boy weighed nothing, checking the shortened stirrups and making sure the lead rope was secure. "I'll pony him along," he told Clara. "You just focus on staying in the saddle." "I can ride," Clara said, a touch defensively. "My father taught me, years ago." "Good." Was that approval in his voice? "Let's go, then." They rode out past the barns and corrals, following a trail that wound upward through stands of pine and aspen. The horses picked their way carefully over ground that was muddy from snowmelt, their breath forming clouds in the cool air. Micah kept up a steady stream of observations, marveling at everything from hawk overhead to the tiny shoots of green pushing through the brown grass. After an hour of steady climbing, they emerged onto a plateau that took Clara's breath away. The land opened up into a vast meadow, surrounded by peaks that still wore caps of snow. A stream wound through the center, its water crystal clear and singing over rocks. On the far side, where the trees began again, Clara could see the remains of a cabin, its roof fallen in, but its log walls still standing. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "My father built that cabin," Jed said, dismounting and helping Micah down. "When he first came to these mountains, before he met my mother, lived there while he built the main house." They walked toward the old structure, Micah running ahead to explore. Clara could see it had been well built, even now showing the care that had gone into its construction. "He brought my mother here after they married," Jed continued. "She said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. Even after they moved to the big house, she'd come here to think, to be alone sometimes." Clara understood. There was something about this place, a sense of peace that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "After she died," Jed said quietly, "I thought about fixing it up, making it livable again, but I couldn't see the point. One man doesn't need two houses." He turned to look at her, and Clara's heart began to race at the intensity in his eyes. "But maybe," he continued, "maybe a family does. This could be a good place to expand. Add on to the cabin, make it a proper house, build up the herd, maybe plant some crops in the lower meadow. It's good land, protected. A man could build something lasting here. It would be perfect." Clara agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thing is," Jed said, taking a step closer, "I'm not much for pretty words. Don't know how to court a woman proper, but these months, having you and Micah at the ranch, it's been good, better than good. House doesn't echo anymore. There's laughter, there's life." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Jed, I know you came looking for security, for a safe place for the boy, and I'll give you that regardless. But somewhere along the way, I started hoping for more, started thinking maybe we could build something together. Not just an arrangement, a real marriage, a real family." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's. She'd want you to have it, if you're willing." Clara looked from the ring to Jed's weathered face, seeing the vulnerability there, the hope mixed with fear of rejection. This man who'd taken them in without question, who'd been endlessly patient with Micah, who'd shared his home and his life, asking nothing in return. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely a breath. Then stronger, "Yes, Jed, I'm willing." His face transformed, the rare smile breaking across it like sunrise over the mountains. With hands that trembled slightly, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Mama?" Micah had returned from his exploring, looking between them with curious eyes. "What's happening?" Clara knelt down to his level. "Jed and I are going to get married. Sweetheart, he's going to be your papa now. If that's all right with you." Micah's face scrunched up in thought. "Does that mean we get to stay forever? And I can keep riding Sally?" "Yes," Jed said, his voice rough. "Forever." Micah considered this for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Good. Can we explore more now?" Clara laughed, the sound carrying across the meadow like bells. Jed reached down and took her hand. helping her to her feet. For a moment they stood close, his hand still holding hers, and Clara felt the world shift and settle into a new configuration, one that felt solid and right. They spent the rest of the day at the meadow, planning where rooms could be added to the cabin, where a garden might go, how the stream could be diverted for irrigation. Micah helped by collecting interesting rocks and chasing butterflies that were just beginning to emerge. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the snow gold and pink, they mounted up for the ride home. Micah, tired from the day's adventures, dozed in the saddle, secure in Jed's careful grip on the lead rope. "When?" Clara asked as they rode side by side. "Soon as possible." Jed replied, "I can ride to town tomorrow, talk to the preacher, unless you want something fancy." "No," Clara said firmly. "Simple is fine. Perfect, actually." That night, after Micah was asleep, they sat by the fire as usual. But everything had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something new and tender. Jed reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his thumb running over the ring. "I should tell you," he said quietly. "I'm not an easy man, set in my ways. Don't talk much." "I've noticed," Clara said, smiling. "But I'll be good to you, to both of you. I swear it. I know." She squeezed his hand. "Jed, you've already been better to us than anyone else ever has. You gave us a home when we had nothing. You've been patient and kind and—" He stopped her words by standing and pulling her gently to her feet. For a moment they stood facing each other, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. Then, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, almost tentative, as if he was afraid of frightening her. Clara's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. When they parted, she saw wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe this was real. "I should go to bed," she said softly, though every part of her wanted to stay. "Yes," he agreed, though he didn't immediately let her go. They stood there for another moment, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, Clara stepped back. "Good night, Jed. Good night, Clara. My Clara." The possessive sent a shiver through her, but not of fear. This was different from Samuel's possessiveness, which had been about control and ownership. This was about belonging, about choosing to be each other's. As she lay in bed that night, turning the ring on her finger, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, from the desperate flight from Silver Creek to this moment of hope and promise. It hadn't been the path she'd planned, but Jed was right. Sometimes the forced path led to better places than the chosen one. Tomorrow they would begin planning a wedding. Soon she would be Clara Hartwell, wife and mother, with a true home and a good man. The thought filled her with a joy so intense it was almost frightening. But stronger than the fear was the certainty that this was right. This was where they belonged. Through her window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house, she heard Jed moving about, banking the fires, checking the locks, all the nighttime rituals that kept them safe. Soon those would be their shared rituals, their shared life. Spring had come to the mountains at last. Word of the engagement spread quickly through the valley. Within days of Jed's trip to town to speak with Reverend Patterson, neighbors Clara hadn't even known existed began appearing at the ranch with congratulations and offerings, preserved fruits, quilts, even a delicate lace collar that old Mrs. Brennan insisted had been waiting 40 years for the right bride. "Haven't seen Jed this content since his ma passed," Mrs. Brennan confided, her weathered hands gentle as she showed Clara how to attach the collar to her best dress. "You've done something good here, child." The wedding was set for the following Sunday, giving them just a week to prepare. Clara threw herself into cooking and cleaning, wanting everything perfect despite Jed's repeated assurances that simple was fine. Micah trailed after both of them, full of questions about the wedding and what it meant to have a papa. 3 days before the ceremony, Clara was in the kitchen making pies when she heard riders approaching. Through the window, she saw two men she didn't recognize dismounting near the barn where Jed was working. Something about their bearing made her uneasy. They had the look of hard-traveled men, dust-covered and watchful. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, staying within easy reach of the door. The men noticed her immediately, and one, a thin fellow with cold eyes, touched his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called. "This the Hartwell place?" Before she could answer, Jed emerged from the barn, his massive frame tense with wariness. "It is. What's your business here?" The thin man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for someone. Woman and a boy. Would have come through maybe 5 months back. Pretty little thing. Dark hair, traveling alone." Clara's blood turned to ice. She gripped the porch rail to keep from swaying. "Lots of folks pass through these parts," Jed said evenly. "What's your interest in them?" "The woman's wanted for questioning," the second man said. He was broader, with scars on his knuckles that spoke of violence. About her late husband's death, some irregularities, you might say. "That so?" Jed's voice was mild, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Got any papers? Proof of what you're saying?" The thin man's smile widened. "Don't need papers to ask questions. Friend, we heard she might have headed this way. Thought maybe she'd answered one of those bride advertisements." "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Micah chose that moment to come running around the corner of the house, calling, "Mama, Uncle Jed, look what I found!" He skidded to a stop when he saw the strangers, immediately pressing against Clara's skirts. The thin man's eyes lit up with triumph. Well, looks like we found what we're looking for. The boy stays here," Jed said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "Whatever business you think you have, it doesn't involve him." "Now, that's where you're wrong," the scarred man said, hand drifting toward his gun. "See, the boy's daddy had some valuable information that died with him. But sometimes children overhear things." "Mama?" Micah whispered, fear clear in his voice. Clara pulled him closer, her mind racing. These weren't lawmen. These were the men Samuel had feared, the ones who'd killed him to keep their secrets safe, and now they'd come for her son. "Gentlemen," Jed said, taking a step forward, "I think you should leave. Now." "Don't think so," the thin man said. "We've come a long way. We'll be taking the woman and boy for questioning. You can cooperate, or—" He let the threat hang. What happened next occurred so fast Clara barely had time to process it. Jed moved with surprising speed for such a large man, his fist connecting with the scarred man's jaw with a crack that echoed off the barn walls. As that man crumpled, the thin one went for his gun, but Jed was already turning, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until the weapon fell to the ground. "Run!" Jed shouted to Clara. "Get inside!" She scooped up Micah and ran, slamming the door behind them and throwing the bolt. Her hands shook as she grabbed the rifle from over the mantel, checking that it was loaded. Through the window, she could see Jed grappling with the thin man while the scarred one struggled to his feet. "Mama, I'm scared," Micah sobbed. "Shh, baby. It's going to be all right." She positioned herself where she could see the door and windows, the rifle heavy in her hands. "Remember what I taught you? If I tell you to run, you go to the root cellar and hide. Don't come out until me or Jed comes for you." Outside, the fight continued, despite being outnumbered. Jed's size and strength gave him an advantage, but then Clara saw the scarred man pull a second gun from his boot. Without thinking, she threw open the door and fired. The shot went wide, hitting the barn wall, but it was enough to distract the man. Jed seized the opportunity, landing a blow that sent him sprawling. The thin man, seeing his partner down and a rifle-wielding woman on the porch, apparently decided the odds had shifted too far. He scrambled for his horse. "This isn't over," he shouted as he mounted. "You can't protect them forever." He spurred his horse hard, disappearing down the trail. His partner, groaning and clutching his ribs, managed to pull himself onto his own mount and follow, weaving unsteadily in the saddle. Jed stood in the yard, chest heaving, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. When he turned to look at Clara, his eyes were storm-dark with fury. "Get Micah inside," he said roughly. "I need to make sure they're gone." An hour later, after Jed had followed their trail far enough to confirm they'd left the valley, they gathered in the kitchen. Clara had cleaned and bandaged the cut on Jed's face, her hand still trembling slightly. Micah sat between them, unusually quiet. "You need to tell me everything," Jed said. "No more secrets. Clara, not if I'm going to protect you both." So, she told him, about Samuel's involvement with smugglers and thieves, about the information he'd gathered, planning to sell it to the law in exchange for immunity, about how his partners had discovered his betrayal and silenced him, about her fear that they thought Micah might have overheard something valuable. "But he didn't," she insisted. "I kept him away from all of that. He doesn't know anything." "Doesn't matter what's true," Jed said grimly. "Matters what they believe." "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I'm so sorry. I've brought danger to your door. We should leave." "No." The word was firm, final. "You're not running anymore. This is your home, our home, and I'll be damned if I let anyone drive you from it. But they'll come back, with more men, probably. Let them." There was something implacable in Jed's face. "I've got friends in this valley. Good men who won't stand for this kind of thing. We'll be ready." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You're going to be my wife in 3 days. That makes you and Micah mine to protect, and I protect what's mine." That night, after Micah was asleep in their bed, too frightened to sleep alone, Clara found herself unable to settle. She paced the kitchen until Jed appeared in the doorway. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "I keep thinking, what if they come back tonight? What if—" "Come here," he said gently. She went to him, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her against his solid warmth. For the first time since seeing those men, she felt safe. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you," he murmured against her hair. "Or to Micah. I swear it. I believe you," she whispered. And she did. This man had already proven he would fight for them, bleed for them. "Jed? I love you." She felt him go very still. Then his arms tightened around her. "Clara, my Clara." His voice was rough with emotion. "I love you too. Have for months. I think, just didn't have the words for it." They stood there in the darkness, holding each other, while outside the wind whispered through the pines. The danger wasn't over. Clara knew those men would return, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. She had Jed, and together they would face whatever came. The next morning, Jed rode out early, returning by noon with 4 men neighbors from the surrounding ranches. They were hard-faced, capable-looking men who listened grimly as Jed explained the situation. "Man threatens a woman and child on your land. That's cause enough for me," said Tom McKendrick, who owned the ranch to the south. "We'll stand with you, Jed." Plans were made. The men would take turns watching the approaches to the ranch. The wedding would go on as scheduled. "Show these bastards they can't disrupt our lives," as McKendrick put it, but with armed men stationed discreetly around the property. Clara spent the next 2 days in a strange state of mixed fear and happiness. Wedding preparations continued, but now she needed bread with a loaded rifle propped in the corner. Micah stayed close to the house, no longer allowed his usual freedom to roam. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke to find frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. The sunrise was spectacular, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, the beauty of the moment took her breath away. "Today's the day, Mama," Micah said solemnly. "You're marrying Jed." "I am," she agreed, smoothing his sleep-tousled hair. "Are you happy about that?" He nodded vigorously. "He keeps us safe, and he's teaching me to ride. And he doesn't yell or throw things like—" He trailed off, but Clara knew he meant Samuel. "No," she said softly. "He doesn't. He's a good man." The wedding was held in the main room of the house, with Reverend Patterson presiding and the handful of neighbors serving as witnesses. Clara wore her best dress with Mrs. Brennan's lace collar, her mother's small gold cross at her throat. Jed had somehow procured a new shirt and had trimmed his beard, looking almost boyishly nervous as he waited by the fireplace. When Clara entered on Mr. McKendrick's arm, he'd insisted on giving her away. Jed's face transformed with a smile so tender it made her eyes burn with tears. Micah stood beside him, very serious in his role as ring-bearer. The ceremony was simple and brief, but every word seemed weighted with meaning. When Jed spoke his vows, his deep voice was steady and sure. "I take you as my wife, to protect and provide for, to honor and cherish, for all my days." Clara's voice shook only slightly as she made her own promises. "I take you as my husband, to stand beside, to make a home with, to love and support, for all my days." When Reverend Patterson pronounced them man and wife, and Jed leaned down to kiss her, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Even the men stationed as guards grinned and called congratulations through the windows. The wedding dinner was a modest but joyful affair. Mrs. Brennan and Mrs. McKendrick had brought additional dishes, and there was even a small cake that Clara had managed to bake despite everything. Micah sat between his new parents, beaming whenever anyone referred to Jed as his papa. As darkness fell and the guests began to leave, each of the men quietly confirmed they'd maintain the watch. "You just enjoy your wedding night," McKendrick told Jed with a wink. "We've got the rest covered." And then, suddenly, they were alone. The three of them, a family now in law as well as in heart. Micah was drooping with exhaustion, and Jed carried him to bed, the boy's arms wrapped trustingly around his neck. When he returned to the main room, Clara was standing by the window, still in her wedding dress. He came up behind her, hands settling gently on her shoulders. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. She turned in his arms, looking up at his dear, scarred face. "None. You? Only that it took so long to find you. This time when he kissed her, there was no audience, no need for restraint." Clara melted against him, feeling the controlled strength in his arms, the tenderness in his touch. When they finally parted, both were breathing hard. "Clara," he said roughly, "I want, but if you're not ready." She silenced him with another kiss. "I'm ready. I'm your wife now. Jed Hartwell. Truly and completely." He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her to what was now their bedroom, and in the warm darkness, with the stars watching through the windows and their child safe in the next room, they came together as husband and wife, sealing with their bodies the vows they'd made with their words. Later, as Clara lay in Jed's arms, listening to his heartbeat and feeling safer than she'd ever felt in her life, she thought about the strange paths that had led them here, from fear and flight to love and family. The danger wasn't over. Those men might return, but whatever came, they would face it together. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. Jed's arms tightened around her. "Love you too, both of you, my family." And in that moment, despite everything, Clara knew they would be all right. They had love, they had each other, and they had a home worth fighting for. That was more than enough. The morning after the wedding dawned bright and cold. Clara woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by the warm presence beside her. Then memory returned. Jed's gentle hands, whispered endearments, the feeling of being truly cherished for the first time in her life. She turned to find her husband already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart skip. "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," he said softly. "Morning, Mr. Hartwell," she replied, unable to suppress her smile. They might have lingered longer, but the sound of Micah's voice calling from the kitchen reminded them that their new life had already begun. Clara dressed quickly while Jed went to tend to their son. Their son, she thought with wonder. How naturally that had come to pass. She found them in the kitchen, Jed showing Micah how to properly stoke the stove. "Got to bank it just right," he was explaining patiently. "Too much air and it burns too fast. Too little and it goes out." "I understand, Papa," Micah said seriously. and Clara saw Jed's face soften at the title. Over breakfast, the small family fell into easy conversation. The guards had reported a quiet night, and plans were made for the day's chores. It felt almost normal, as if armed men weren't patrolling their borders, as if danger wasn't lurking somewhere beyond the mountains. "I thought we might start moving some things to the meadow cabin," Jed suggested. "Begin fixing it up proper. Make it livable again." "Can I help?" Micah asked eagerly. "Course you can. Man needs to learn building skills." Clara watched them plan, her heart full. This was what she'd dreamed of. Not just safety, but belonging. A real family, making real plans for the future. 3 days passed in this manner. The guards remained vigilant, but reported no signs of trouble. Clara began to hope that perhaps the men had been scared off, had decided she and Micah weren't worth the risk. She should have known better. It was early evening on the 4th day when Tom McKendrick came riding hard into the yard. Jed went out to meet him, and Clara watched through the window as the two men conferred. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in their postures. When Jed came back inside, his face was grim. Strangers in town, 5 of them, asking questions about a woman and boy. Clara's hand went to her throat. The same men? Tom didn't recognize the descriptions, but they're cut from the same cloth. Hard cases, all of them. What do we do? Jed was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he knelt down to Micah's level. "Son, I need you to listen real careful. Some bad men might come here. If they do, I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" Micah nodded solemnly. "Yes, Papa." "Good boy. Now, if Mama or I tell you to hide, you run straight to the root cellar. Remember where I showed you the blankets and water?" Another nod. "You stay there until one of us comes for you, no matter what you hear. Understand?" "I understand." Jed ruffled his hair, then stood. "Clara, I need you to pack some things. Food, water, warm clothes. Just in case." She didn't question him, just moved to comply. As she worked, her mind raced. 5 men, more than they could reasonably fight off, even with help. And if these men were as determined as they seemed, "Maybe we should leave," she said quietly. "Take Micah and run. I won't have you hurt because of my past." "Our past," Jed corrected firmly. "We're married now. Your troubles are mine." He pulled her into his arms. "Besides, running's no good. They'd just follow. Better to make our stand here, where we know the ground." That night, they barely slept. Jed kept watch by the window while Clara dozed fitfully, starting at every sound. Micah, thankfully, slept peacefully, unaware of his parents' vigil. Dawn came without incident, but the tension remained thick. Jed went out to check with the guards, returning with troubling news. McKendrick's man spotted them. They're camped about 5 miles east. Looks like they're scouting, trying to figure the best approach. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be today. Could be..." He was interrupted by the sound of a single gunshot echoing across the valley. Then another, then silence. "That came from the South Pass," Jed said, grabbing his rifle. "Stay inside. Lock the doors." But before he could leave, they saw a rider approaching fast. It was young Jim McKendrick, Tom's son, and he was bleeding from a graze on his arm. "They're coming!" he shouted. "Got past our position. Dad's trying to slow them down, but there's too many." Jed helped the boy inside. "How many?" 7, maybe 8. They got reinforcements." Clara's heart sank. 8 men, even with their neighbor's help. They were outnumbered. "Clara, take Micah to the cellar," Jed ordered. "Now." "No." She surprised herself with the firmness of her voice. "I can shoot. You need every gun you can get." "Clara, I won't hide while you fight for us. We do this together." He looked like he wanted to argue, but another gunshot, closer this time, decided him. "Micah, cellar, now." The boy ran without argument, his face pale but determined. Clara grabbed the rifle she'd been practicing with, checking the load. Her hands were steady despite the fear coursing through her. They took positions at the windows just as the riders came into view. 8 men, spread out in a rough line, approaching cautiously. Clara recognized the thin man from before, his face set in grim determination. "Last chance to leave peaceful like," the thin man called. "We just want the woman and boy. No need for anyone else to die." "Only dying today will be you if you don't turn around," Jed shouted back. The answer was a volley of gunfire that shattered the front windows. Clara ducked, glass raining down around her. When she peered up again, the men had dismounted and were taking cover behind whatever they could find. What followed was a nightmare of noise and smoke and fear. Clara fired when she had clear shots, trying not to think about the fact that she was shooting at human beings. Beside her, Jed was calm and methodical, picking his targets carefully. But they were outnumbered, and the attackers were slowly working their way closer. Clara could see 2 men circling around toward the barn, trying to flank them. "The barn," she said urgently. Jed cursed. "If they fire it, the smoke will drive us out." He thought quickly. "Can you hold here?" "Yes." He squeezed her shoulder, then slipped out the back door, moving with surprising stealth for such a large man. Clara forced herself to keep firing, to keep the attackers' attention on the house. She saw Jed reach the barn just as the 2 flanking men rounded its corner. There was a brief, violent struggle, and then Jed emerged alone, blood on his knuckles but moving steadily. The thin man saw it too. "Rush them!" he shouted. "All together!" The remaining attackers rose as one, charging toward the house. Clara fired rapidly. Saw 1 man fall, but the others kept coming. "This is it," she thought. "We're going to be overrun." Then, like something out of a story, she heard the thunder of hoofbeats. Tom McKendrick and 6 other men came charging over the rise, guns blazing. The attackers, caught in the open, tried to retreat but found themselves trapped between 2 forces. The fight was brief and decisive. Faced with superior numbers and caught in poor position, the remaining attackers threw down their weapons. The thin man tried to run but was brought down by McKendrick himself, who despite his years could still rope like a younger man. In the sudden silence that followed, Clara realized she was shaking. The rifle fell from her numb fingers as Jed burst back through the door. "Clara, are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine." But her legs gave out, and he caught her, holding her tight against his chest. "It's over," he murmured. "It's all over." They retrieved Micah from the cellar, the boy flying into their arms with tears of relief. As a family, they stood in the doorway, watching as their neighbors rounded up the surviving attackers. The thin man, blood running from a gash on his head, snarled at Clara. "This ain't over. You think you've won, but there's others. They know what your husband knew. They'll keep coming." "No," said a new voice. "They won't." Everyone turned to see a man in a U.S. Marshal's badge riding up, followed by 2 deputies. The marshal, a weathered man with keen eyes, dismounted and surveyed the scene. "Marshal Frank Garrison," he introduced himself. "We've been tracking these men for months, part of the Colson gang, wanted for murder, smuggling, and too many other crimes to list." He looked at Clara. "Your Mrs. Samuel Whitmore?" "Mrs. Jed Hartwell now," she said, feeling Jed's arm tighten around her. The marshal nodded. "We know about your late husband, ma'am. He was trying to turn state's evidence when he was killed. These men," he gestured to the captives, "have been eliminating witnesses. You're the last loose end." "I don't know anything," Clara insisted. "Neither does my son." "I believe you," the marshal said. "But more importantly, with these men captured, the rest of the gang will scatter. Without their leaders, they're nothing. You're safe now." As the lawmen led the prisoners away and the neighbors began to disperse with handshakes and promises to help repair the damage, Clara found herself standing in her bullet-riddled house, trying to process it all. "We need new windows," she said faintly, and then began to laugh, high and slightly hysterical. Jed pulled her close, Micah between them. "We need a lot of things. but we've got what matters most. That night, after the glass was swept up and boards nailed over the broken windows, after statements were given and hands were shaken, after Micah was tucked into bed with extra hugs and reassurances, Clara and Jed sat together on the porch, looking out at their land. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "I brought violence to your home, to our home. You brought life to this home," Jed corrected. "The rest, that's just the price of living sometimes. The important thing is we faced it together." "Together," Clara agreed, leaning into his warmth. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, Clara felt a deep peace settling into her bones. They had been tested and had survived. More than survived. They had proved that they were truly a family, willing to fight for each other, to stand together against whatever came. "Jed? I want to help rebuild the meadow cabin. Make it into that bigger house you talked about." She felt him smile against her hair. "Planning for the future?" "Yes, a big future. With more children, God willing. A real ranch legacy to pass on." His arms tightened around her. "I'd like that. Micah could use brothers and sisters." "He could," Clara agreed. "And I'd like to give them to him. To you." They went inside then, to their bed and each other, to the life they were building together. The windows might be broken, but the foundation was strong. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to grow. In the root cellar, forgotten in the chaos, lay the provisions Clara had packed. They wouldn't be needed now. There would be no more running, no more hiding. Elk Mountain Ranch was their home, and here they would stay, building something lasting and good. The past was finally behind them. The future stretched ahead, bright with promise. The weeks following the attack passed in a blur of rebuilding and recovery. True to their word, the neighbors pitched in to help repair the damage to the house. New windows were installed, bullet holes were patched, and slowly the visible signs of violence faded. But the bonds forged in that crucible of danger remained strong. It was during this time of rebuilding that Clara noticed the change in how the townspeople regarded them. When she and Jed went to Willow Springs for supplies, she was greeted not with suspicion and whispers, but with nods of respect and genuine warmth. "Heard you handled yourself well during the trouble, Mr. Donnelly said as he filled their order at the general store. "Takes courage to stand and fight like that. We did what we had to," Clara replied, still uncomfortable with the attention. "That's what makes good neighbors," the shopkeeper said firmly. "Folks who stand up for what's theirs and help others do the same. Even Mrs. Crawford at the hotel, who had once been so eager to put them out, now greeted Clara with something approaching friendliness. "That boy of yours is growing like a weed," she observed, watching Micah help Jed load the wagon. "Turning into a fine young man." Clara smiled, following her gaze. It was true. In the month since they'd arrived at the ranch, Micah had shot up 2 inches and filled out from good food and hard work. More than the physical changes, though, was the confidence he now carried. Gone was the frightened, wary child who had hidden behind her skirts. In his place was a boy who walked tall and called Jed Papa with perfect naturalness. As spring deepened into summer, work on the meadow cabin began in earnest. Jed had drawn up plans for expanding the original structure into a proper house, and every spare moment was spent hauling lumber and stones up the mountain trail. "Why do we need another house when we have a good one?" Micah asked one day, helping to carry lighter boards. "A ranch this size can support more than one family." Jed explained, "Someday, when you're grown, you might want your own place, or we might hire hands who need somewhere to live." "Or," Clara added softly, placing a hand on her still flat stomach, "we might need more room for a growing family." Jed's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he took in her meaning. The board he was carrying slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the ground. "Clara, are we?" She nodded, tears of joy pricking her eyes. "Come Christmas, Micah will have a brother or sister." Jed crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, lifting her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "A baby," he breathed, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "What baby?" Micah demanded, confused by the adult's emotion. Clara laughed, wiping her eyes as Jed set her down. "Mama's going to have a baby, sweetheart. You're going to be a big brother." Micah's face went through several expressions before settling on cautious excitement. "A real baby? That I can help with?" "That's right," Jed said, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll be the best big brother in Colorado." The knowledge of the coming child infused their work with new purpose. The meadow house was no longer just a future project, but a legacy they were building. Jed became even more protective of Clara, trying to limit her physical work despite her protests that she was perfectly healthy. "I'm having a baby, not made of glass," she said in exasperation one day when he tried to stop her from carrying a bucket of water. "Humor me," he replied, taking the bucket from her hands. "Never had a pregnant wife before, still learning the rules." It was during this time of hope and planning that the past made one final attempt to intrude on their happiness. Clara was alone at the house, Jed and Micah having ridden to check on the far pastures, when she heard a horse approaching. Through the window, she saw a lone rider, a woman, well-dressed but travel-worn. Clara went to the door, rifle within easy reach but not displayed. The woman dismounted gracefully despite her obvious exhaustion. "Mrs. Hartwell?" she asked, and Clara nodded warily. "My name is Margaret Coulson. I believe you knew my brother." Clara's blood ran cold. Coulson, the gang leader Marshal Garrison had mentioned. Her hand moved toward the rifle. "Please," Margaret said quickly, holding up empty hands. "I'm not here for revenge. I need to know." Against her better judgment, Clara found herself inviting the woman in, though she kept the rifle close. Margaret Coulson was perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and an air of profound sadness. "Your brother was a criminal," Clara said bluntly. "He had my husband killed." "I know." Margaret's voice was quiet. "I know what William became, but he wasn't always that way. He was my little brother once, before—" She trailed off, then gathered herself. "I'm not here to make excuses. I just needed to see the woman he was so determined to find, to understand why." Clara studied her visitor, seeing not threat but genuine grief. "He believed my son had overheard something valuable. He was wrong. Micah knows nothing of his father's dealings." "I believe you," Margaret sighed. "William was paranoid near the end, saw threats everywhere. The marshal told me he died in prison last week. Fever, they said. I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said, meaning it. Whatever William Coulson had been, he had been this woman's brother. Margaret smiled sadly. "You're kind to say so. After everything." She stood to leave, then paused. "I wanted you to know, there's no one left who cares about the old business. No one will come looking for you again. You're free to live your life." After she left, Clara stood at the window for a long time, watching the dust settle from her departure. When Jed and Micah returned, she told them about the visit. "Should have been here," Jed said, frowning. "It's finished now," Clara assured him. "Truly finished. We can move forward without looking back." And they did. As summer ripened into autumn, the meadow house neared completion. It stood proud against the mountain backdrop, larger than the original cabin but still modest. A home built for living, not showing off. Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, though she tired more easily as she grew larger. Micah appointed himself her special helper, bringing her water, insisting she rest, talking excitedly to her belly about all the things he would teach his sibling. "I'll show them how to ride Sally," he would say, "and where the best fishing spots are, and how to track rabbits, and maybe let them learn to walk first," Clara suggested. Laughing, the first snow was falling when the pains began. Jed, who had been calm through gunfights and danger, turned white as a sheet. "I'll ride for the doctor," he said, already reaching for his coat. "There's no time," Clara gasped. Mrs. Brennan, get Mrs. Brennan. The next hours were a blur of pain and effort. With Mrs. Brennan's experienced hands guiding her through. Jed stayed by her side, letting her grip his hand hard enough to leave bruises, murmuring encouragement. Micah waited anxiously in the kitchen, ears straining for any sound. Then, as dawn broke over the snow-covered peaks, a new voice joined their family, the strong, healthy cry of a newborn. A daughter, Mrs., Brennan announced, placing the wrapped bundle in Clara's arms. Perfect as a spring morning. Clara looked down at the tiny face, overwhelmed by love. "Hello, little one," she whispered. Jed's large finger traced the baby's cheek with infinite gentleness. "She's beautiful, like her mama." Can I see?" Micah's voice came from the doorway, hesitant but eager. "Come meet your sister," Clara said, making room for him on the bed. Micah approached slowly, eyes wide with wonder. The baby's hand escaped her wrapping, tiny fingers grasping at air. Without prompting, Micah offered his finger, gasping when she gripped it. "She's so small," he breathed. "What's her name?" Clara and Jed exchanged glances. They had discussed names for months without settling on one. But now, looking at their daughter, Clara knew. "Grace," she said. "Grace Elizabeth Hartwell. Because she's a gift of grace we never expected." "Grace," Micah repeated solemnly. "I like it. Hi, Grace. I'm your big brother. I'm going to take care of you forever." Watching her children together, the boy she had born in fear and uncertainty, and the daughter born into love and safety, Clara felt her heart might burst from fullness. Jed's arm came around her, encompassing their whole family in his protective embrace. "My girls," he said softly. "My boy. My family." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside the house that Jed had built and Clara had made a home, all was warmth and love and new beginnings. Later, as Clara dozed with the baby at her breast and Micah curled at her side, Jed sat watching over them all, his scarred hands, so gentle with those he loved, rested on the quilt his mother had made. He thought of the advertisement he'd placed what seemed like a lifetime ago. Seeking a wife to help with the ranch, he had gotten so much more. A woman of courage, a son to carry on his legacy, and now a daughter to cherish. The good Lord worked in mysterious ways, his mother used to say. Looking at his family, Jed could only agree. From Clara's desperate flight had come this, a love strong enough to weather any storm, a family built on choice rather than just blood. Tomorrow there would be work. There was always work on a ranch. The cattle needed tending. The new house needed finishing touches. And now there was a baby to care for. But tonight, with the snow falling soft outside and his family safe within, Jed Hartwell was content to simply sit and guard their sleep. The luckiest man in Colorado territory. "No child here is unloved," he whispered to the sleeping infant, remembering his promise to Micah. "No child here is unwanted. You're all mine, and I'm yours, forever." And in the warm circle of lamplight, with the mountains standing eternal guard, the Hartwell family slept peacefully, their past finally laid to rest, their future bright with promise. Winter held the mountains in its grip for 3 more months, but inside the Hartwell home, warmth and life flourished. Grace grew round-cheeked and bright-eyed, her gurgling laughter filling the house. Micah proved to be a devoted brother, always eager to help with the baby, reading to her from his primer even though she was too young to understand. "She likes it when I read," he insisted when Jed gently pointed out that 3-month-olds couldn't follow stories. "See? She's smiling." Clara, recovered from the birth and glowing with contentment, divided her time between caring for Grace and preparing for spring planting. She had grand plans for a kitchen garden that would supply them through the next winter, and spent evening hours poring over seed catalogs Mrs. Brennan had lent her. It was on a clear morning in early March, with the sun finally showing real warmth, that Jed made an announcement at breakfast. "Ice is breaking up on the lower roads. I can make it to town today if I'm careful." We need supplies." Clara agreed, mentally cataloging their dwindling stores. "And I have that list of seeds to order." "Was thinking of more than supplies," Jed said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. Tom McKendrick mentioned his nephew back east. Young man, knows cattle, looking to come west and learn ranching. With the baby and all. Might be good to have extra hands. Clara considered this. They had managed alone so far, but with Grace needing care and the ranch growing, it would help, she admitted. "Especially if we're going to expand the herd like you planned. That's what I figured. And if he works out, he could live in the meadow house. Makes more sense than leaving it empty." Micah, who had been quietly eating his porridge, suddenly looked up. "Someone else is going to live in our house? The one we built?" "That was always the plan. Son." Jed said gently, "A ranch needs workers, and wouldn't it be nice to have other folks around? Maybe he'll have children someday, and you'll have friends nearby." Micah considered this seriously, then nodded. "As long as they're nice, and they have to know that Sally is my horse, I'll make sure to tell him," Jed promised solemnly. 2 weeks later, Robert McKendrick arrived. He was 22, earnest and eager, with the same steady reliability that marked his uncle. Clara liked him immediately, especially when he treated Micah with respect rather than dismissing him as just a child. "I hear you know these mountains pretty well," Robert said to the boy. "Maybe you could show me around when your PA can spare you?" Micah puffed up with importance. "I know all the best spots, and I can teach you about the horses. Sally doesn't like strangers, but if I introduce you proper, she'll be fine." Having another adult on the ranch transformed their daily life. Jed could tackle larger projects knowing Robert was tending the regular chores. Clara found she could take Grace with her to the garden without worrying about leaving something undone. And Micah had someone new to pepper with questions and show off his growing skills. As spring bloomed fully across the mountains, painting the meadows with wildflowers, the Hartwell Ranch thrived. The expanded house in the meadow was finished, and Robert moved in with obvious appreciation for having his own space. The cattle, having survived the winter well, produced a good crop of calves. The garden Clara had planned took shape, neat rows of vegetables promising abundance. It was in May, with Grace sitting up on her own and babbling what Micah insisted were real words, that Clara realized she was pregnant again. "Already?" Jed said when she told him, his expression mixing joy with concern. "Grace is only 6 months old. Babies come when they come," Clara said, echoing Mrs. Brennan's practical wisdom. "And wouldn't it be wonderful for Grace to have a close sibling, like Micah had always wished for?" Jed pulled her close, his hand splaying protectively over her still flat stomach. "Another baby. Our family's growing faster than the vegetable garden." "Are you complaining?" Clara teased. "Never," he said firmly, kissing her forehead. "Just wondering if we need to build another house." That evening, they told Micah, who received the news with the wisdom of an experienced big brother. "I'll teach this one too," he declared. "Grace is too little to ride yet, but by the time the new baby comes, maybe she'll be walking." Summer passed in a golden haze of hard work and deep contentment. The ranch prospered. Robert proved himself invaluable, and Clara's pregnancy progressed smoothly despite the challenge of caring for an increasingly mobile Grace. Micah divided his time between his chores, his lessons, and playing big brother with a serious dedication. The harvest was the best they'd ever had. The root cellar filled with potatoes and turnips, carrots and onions. Clara preserved vegetables and made jam from the wild berries Micah gathered. The larder shelves groaned under the weight of their abundance. "We'll eat well this winter," Clara said with satisfaction, surveying their stores. "And we'll need it, with another mouth to feed." Jed replied, wrapping his arms around her expanded waist from behind. It was a perfect moment, until Micah came running from the barn, shouting for his parents. Both Clara and Jed tensed, memories of past dangers flooding back, but the boy's face was excited, not frightened. "Robert's back from town with news. There's going to be a harvest dance at the Brennan Ranch. Can we go, please?" Clara and Jed exchanged glances. They hadn't attended any social gatherings since their wedding, too focused on building their life to think about society. "I don't know," Clara said hesitantly. "With the baby coming soon." "That's exactly why you should go," Robert said, appearing behind Micah. "Pardon my saying, ma'am, but you've been working hard all summer. A little music and dancing would do you good. I can watch the stock for one evening." "Please, Mama," Micah pleaded. "I've never been to a real dance," looking at her son's hopeful face. Clara felt her resistance crumble. They had spent so long in survival mode. Perhaps it was time to truly join the community that had supported them. "All right," she said, and Micah whooped with joy. The night of the dance was clear and cool, with stars brilliant in the mountain sky. Clara had altered one of her dresses to accommodate her pregnancy, and Jed had trimmed his beard and donned his wedding shirt. Micah, scrubbed clean and wearing his best clothes, practically vibrated with excitement. Even Grace, carried in Clara's arms, seemed to sense the festive mood, babbling and reaching for everything. The Brennan barn had been transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the gathered families. A small band fiddle, guitar, and harmonica played lively tunes. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by all the ranch wives. "Clara, Jed, Mrs." Brennan bustled over, beaming. "And look at this family, my goodness. Micah, you've grown a foot since spring." As they were drawn into the crowd, greeting neighbors and accepting congratulations on their growing family, Clara felt a profound sense of belonging wash over her. These people, who had stood with them against danger, who had helped rebuild their home, who now celebrated their joys. This was community. This was home. "Dance with me?" Jed asked, appearing at her elbow as a slower tune began. "I'm not sure I remember how," Clara admitted. "And with this belly—" "We'll manage," he said, leading her onto the floor. They swayed together, careful of her condition, lost in each other despite the crowd around them. Micah had been claimed by the McKendrick boys for some game, and Mrs. Brennan had spirited Grace away to show off to the other grandmothers. "Happy?" Jed asked softly. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Clara replied, resting her head against his chest. "When I answered your advertisement, I was just looking for survival. I never imagined—" "I know," he said, his arms tightening around her. "I was just looking for help with the ranch. Instead, I found everything." 3 weeks later, as the first snow began to fall, Clara gave birth to their son. The labor was easier than with Grace, and by sunset she was holding another perfect baby, this one with Jed's dark hair and serious expression. "What shall we call him?" she asked, watching Jed cradle his son with experienced hands. "I was thinking Samuel," Jed said carefully, watching her face. "Not for his father, but for the journey that brought you to me. Turn something painful into something good." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. This man, who had every reason to resent her first husband's memory, was offering redemption even to the past. "Samuel James Hartwell," she agreed. "Sam." Micah, now an old hand at big brotherhood, took the new addition in stride. "He's smaller than Grace was," he observed, "but he's got big hands. He'll be good with horses." "How can you tell that?" Clara asked, amused. "I just can," Micah said confidently. As winter settled over the mountains once more, the Hartwell house was full to bursting with life and love. 4 children's voices would soon fill its rooms. Micah's increasingly breaking with approaching adolescence, Grace's baby chatter, and Sam's newborn cries. On a quiet evening, with both babies finally asleep and Micah doing his lessons by the fire, Clara found herself standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered land that had become their sanctuary. Jed came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking?" "About circles," Clara said softly. "How life moves in circles. 1.5 years ago, I stood at a different window, watching snow fall, terrified and alone. Now you're stuck with a house full of children and a husband who can't imagine life without you." Jed finished, The best kinda stuck, Clara agreed, turning in his arms. Through the window, the mountains stood eternal and protective, guardians of this valley that had given them refuge. In the barn, the horses were warm and fed. In the meadow house, Robert was probably reading by his own fire, part of their extended family. And here, in the home built by love and defended by courage, the Hartwell family was complete. No unwanted children here, Jed murmured, echoing his old promise. No unloved souls, just family. Just family, Clara agreed, and lifted her face for his kiss. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peace, but inside, warmed by fire and love. The Hartwells were already looking forward to spring, to new growth, to all the years of joy and challenge ahead. They had traveled far to find each other, through loss and fear, through danger and doubt. But every step had led them here, to this moment, to this family, to this love that was stronger than any storm. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through Clara and Jed's story. I hope you enjoyed this Wild West tale of love, courage, and family. Where are you listening from today? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of the American frontier. And please share your thoughts about Clara and Jed's journey. Did their story touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Let me know below.